Welcome to the course Digital Transformation and Technological Innovation. So, we are into our second module, that is digital infrastructure. So, let us continue from where we left in the last session. So, next point about operating system that we are discussing, we completed the the individual or single user case. So, we are talking about the operating system and the in this particular setting sphere of influence when it is work group or enterprise, right. Then what are the defining features that we can look at? Now the popular operating system in this category are Windows Server, Unix and Linux, right. Now we will try and understand some of the defining features of these three operating system, and therefore it will be something more informative for data driven or informative decision making for an organization. So, we will look at some of the key technical and operational criteria and try and understand the difference. So, let us start. Right. So, in an enterprise context, first important angle could be licensing. So, organization they need to understand what kind of licensing they are getting into, because that might have in terms of cost implication and then legal implications as well. So, if we talk about the Windows Server, so that is a proprietary product from the Microsoft. So, therefore, one has to take a license from them, and so you can see requires paid licenses per device. So, depending on the number of servers or workstation that you might be running in, and you might be running Windows Server because you might be in the work group or enterprise sphere of influence, then those many licenses the organization might have to buy from Microsoft. Then the next category is Unix. So, Unix is also proprietary. So, there are more firms which are working in this space. So, especially in the server space, it is the Unix that sells more, and this is AIX. One option is AIX, which is from IBM, right, and then HPUX, and which is from HP, and Solaris is also there, which is from Sun, which I think later got acquired by Oracle. So, these are some of the common, some of the popular operating system for enterprise sphere of influence, and but generally high cost. So, these companies, if we look at the business of these companies, so HP or Dell or Sun or IBM, so they are into selling servers, servers for mainframe servers, other servers, and traditional servers and blade servers, right. So, all these different servers that we have already spoken about, right. So, these companies are into this server business, and the operating system is shipped along with those servers. So, the cost of these operating system is bundled with the servers, but then it is perceived to be a high cost in the market, because more often than not these operating systems are the go to operating system for enterprises because of the security and other mission critical features that these operating systems offer, right. Then the Linux is there, open source, which is mostly free. So, anyone who is not into a mission critical or very critical kind of business, right, they can go for Linux open source. There are lots of companies which provide services in terms of installation, upgradation, and ongoing support, right. So, there are lots of such company which do that. So, businesses or work groups, they can actually go for Linux, which is open source, mostly free, right. Moving on, next is a primary interface. So, how these operating systems are different in terms of primary interface that they provide. So, Windows Server, we look at the main primary interface is graphical user interface, GUI. That is the main selling point for most of Microsoft products, especially in the system software category, whether it is about Windows operating system or in this case Windows Server, so, right. So, it also includes PowerShell and CMD. So, it also have what we call command line interface, CLI option, but GUI interface that actually increases the ease of use of Windows Server. So, businesses which are not running something that is very critical, and so IT might be just a supporting role for them to run business, right. They might go for ease of use that is being offered by the Windows Server, and also CLI interface is also supported, right. Then Unix, so this is command line interface, so this is highly specialized. So therefore the people who would be working would also be slightly more skilled, because they need to understand the CLI interface just to be able to do the admin role in terms of managing day to day things for the Unix server, right. So it provides the CLI command line interface, highly specialized, and therefore more skills more skills are required. Here in this case of Windows Server, people who are working in the company, they also can over time learn little bit of a skill that is needed for Windows Server and the ease of use that it provides. But that is not the case with the Unix being highly specialized. Then if we talk about the Linux, there is also command line interface. Bash shell is provided, right, and there are optional GUIs also that you can install, that you can have, right, from community driven projects packages, right. So Linux, if we look at the primary interface, Linux in a way sits in between the Windows Server and the Unix. So Unix for more mission critical, more important industries or businesses. Windows Server where the server part is less important and you would just go for the ease of use, because the core businesses more or less runs on its own, just some server support that is needed maybe to run website or some app, right. Linux goes both ways, right, because open source free. So if businesses they don't have they need the server in terms of supporting them for some IT activities, some information systems that they need to run, right. Then this is low cost, the cost is lower, so the businesses which are interested they can go for this. But then again, a skill for this is also slightly higher skill set is required for the CLI interface and all that. Moving on, next criteria is kernel architecture. So what are the differences that we can take at a higher level among these three operating systems, right. So in case of Windows Server, the hybrid kernel kind of setup that is there, so that is how we can categorize Windows Server. So slightly hybrid kind of kernel architecture it follows. Then if we look at Unix, then this is more like monolithic kernel, right. But obviously, as we talked about, there are different server vendors, server companies that are there, IBM, HP, Sun, Oracle and others, right. So there are slight variation in terms of the Unix flavors that are being sold, whether it is IBM AIX or HP UX or Solaris. So because of that, the kernel is monolithic, but the variations are there because of the changes in the company and the server and the operating system and also the server. So Unix often highly optimized for specific hardware, right. So we earlier also talked about that system software they depend on the kind of hardware that is there, and they can be developed in such a manner that they are able to exploit the hardware strength, computer hardware strength that is there. So in case of Unix, because typically it would be used in a mission critical or important services, then there it makes sense to spend time and optimize that for a specific hardware. So again, monolithic kernel and much more optimization that is typically done, right. If we look at Linux, that is also monolithic kernel. Now while we were talking about kernel, we did not define it. So what is a kernel? A core part or brain of an OS, right. So kernel is earlier we have spoken about the OS and what it is about, right. Now within OS we identify something, a component called as kernel, which is considered as core part of OS or the brain of OS. So what it does, so kernel is like in a way acts as a bridge between software and hardware. So any operation, any interaction that happens between the software and the hardware, that is actually done by the kernel, which acts like a brain of operating system. Then what is left over part for the OS, which also contains kernel, the remaining part where OS can focus is it can act as a bridge between the user and the software, right. So user gets an interface, uses the interface provided by the OS and interacts with applications and sometimes with the system software as well. So OS kernel focuses on the interaction between the actual software, actual application and hardware, right. And OS focuses more on the user and the and the software part. So the interaction level, we can say two layered approach can be seen. One, closer to the hardware, which is done by the kernel. Second, closer to the user, which is the focus of the OS, right. So moving on, so main difference: Windows Server, hybrid kernel, Unix and Linux having the monolithic kernel, and then Unix slightly higher level of optimization to the hardware, right. Moving on, another criteria that we can look at is for operating system is central directory service, right. So what is the role of central directory service? So it manages users, devices and security policies. So users would be logging into the system and the devices would be plugged in or connected to the server or the system, right. And the security policy that would be needed to manage the access control for the users, and then also to avoid any attacks or leakages in terms of data and other compromises, right. So it manages users, devices and security policies, central directory service, that right. So for Windows Server, the name of this central directory service is Active Directory or AD. So this is feature rich out of the box, right. When Windows Server shipped in that itself, you get a very feature rich Active Directory. So it becomes easier, or maybe easier to manage different kind of settings for user devices, and as well as the security policies, right. So includes group policy objects for automated configuration, also can be eased out because there are certain group policy objects that you can quickly apply, right. So in that way also it's quite feature rich. Then if we look at the Unix for the central directory service part, then there are vendor specific LDAP tools, right, because there are different vendors for Unix as we talked about, IBM, HP, Sun and / Oracle. So here what do we mean by LDAP? Full form is lightweight directory access protocol. So this is another tool for managing directory service, which is mainly used by the Unix. There are different versions for different kind of Unix flavors. Then for Linux, there are some open source tools. For example, Open LDAP is there, which is like a generic LDAP server. So actually Unix, those vendor specific LDAP tools, they do lot more porting, as I have spoken about. Many of these Unix operating system, they actually follow the development that is happening in the Linux, which is an open source community. So we'll talk more about open source community and those software products in the next module, right. But Linux, the development that is happening in Linux products, for example Open LDAP, which is generic LDAP server. So some of the LDAP tools which are used in Unix, they will actually looking at those developments and porting them back, some of the relevant or desired changes in the open source products, they will be porting back to their Unix flavor, individual Unix flavors, right. Then there is another free IPA, which is more comprehensive identity management suite, right. So it is in a way closer to what we have Active Directory in Windows Server. So Linux again sits in between the Windows and Unix. So Unix vendor specific LDAP tools, LDAP setup is there, and Windows very feature rich Active Directory, and then the Linux gives both the option, the traditional, the generic LDAP tool, and then also free IPA, comprehensive identity management, that is also available in the form of package which users can install. Moving on, so what are the differences in terms of file system? So first we'll talk about the Windows Server. So Windows Server, typically it organizes a disk into separate logical volumes using drive layers. So this we see in our PCs, laptop also, which more and often than not are having Windows operating system. But even in the case of Windows Server, the same thing is there, separate logical volumes, drive layers, C:, backslash or D:, backslash, so different logical volume. So essentially specialization is happening, what goes in C and what goes in D, so that the enterprise or the users can decide, and that so therefore the way disk is being organized there itself, at that point itself, the specialization starts in this case for the file system. So files are structured objects. So overall philosophy of Windows Server is that files are structured objects, and there is a master file table which is used to manage these objects, right. And treatment of these objects or files. So there is a specialized treatment, depending on what kind of resource we are talking about, what kind of object we are talking about, whether it is a device driver file or some user file. So the treatment will vary, right. So the way you access a user file or the way you access a device file, that varies in the case of Windows Server. So a specialized treatment is there depending on the kind of object that you are trying to access, right. So whether in terms of managing the disk or whether in terms of interaction with the files, both ways Windows Server goes for more specialized approach, right. So this is about file system for Windows Server. Now moving on, how Unix is different. So Unix, quite different in terms of, if we compare that to Windows Server, right. So this Unix goes for a single unified tree starting from a root directory. So there is a root directory, and from that a tree is created. So all the files and folders are structured or unified under that root directory, under that root node, right. So therefore a single unified tree is there, and everything is considered a file. So there is no, in terms of interacting with a file, there is no difference, just like what we just discussed for the Windows Server case. So everything is a file, and a strict hierarchical structure with index inode are used. So in case of Windows Server, it was a master file table MFT. In case of Unix, it is inodes or index nodes, and approach is more unified, more generic towards all kinds of file. In Windows Server, approach is more specialized depending on whether device driver file or maybe some normal regular user file. So unified treatment for all files. And if we look at Linux, that is pretty much same as Unix, right. So whether Unix or Linux, so in terms of file system, they behave the same way, and there is a single unified tree kind of approach that is followed here, right. While Windows Server being more likely to follow a specialized approach, right. And root directory is expressed like forward slash. So here you can see the backward slash when we are talking about the drive laters, backward slash, and here you see the forward slash, and so the whole path would go like that, A, B, C, and then D, E, F. So in this way the path names will go, and here in case of Windows Server, the path name will go like this, right. So some differences in terms of how file paths are created. Moving on, now we look at the kind of hardware support that is there for these three operating systems, that is Windows Server and Unix and Linux. So in case of Windows Server, the extensive hardware support is there because Windows ecosystem is quite huge. The ecosystem is also coming from the PC segment, and that is extending back to the Windows Server also. So there are lots of companies which provide or which develop hardware which is compatible to a PC which is running Windows or Windows Server, right. So a wide range of standard drivers are readily available for different kind of hardware devices, right. So very good in terms of good benefit of the ecosystem in case of a Windows Server. But if we talk about the Unix, then the hardware support is limited, right. So this is often specific to vendor hardware, right. So more often than not, you will have to stick to the the vendor hardware. Whatever server that you bought, Unix will actually come shipped with more often than not. This is the regularly this is the way Unix is being sold. So you buy a server from those vendors like IBM, HP, Sun, Oracle, and other companies, and you actually get the Unix operating system shipped along with the server. And therefore when it comes to drivers or whether it comes to hardware support, again you will have to fall back to that vendor. If we look at Linux, so this is also quite broad, maybe not as broad or like the Microsoft case, Windows case, right. So this also supports varied architectures, and because there is a open source community, Linux being an open source system software, so there is an open source community which is continuously contributing to this, and therefore the footprints of Linux are also quite big, across organizations, across countries. So therefore, hardware device manufacturers, they also provide support for Linux. So there would be drivers and would be available for Linux for their hardware devices, right. So again, Linux sitting in between Windows Server and Unix limited, Linux in between, and Windows extensive kind of hardware support and the corresponding driver support. Now we move on to the next factor, that is security focus. So in security focus, if we look at Windows Server, so there are lots of user friendly tools. So again, main strength of Windows ecosystem is being end user friendly, right, providing ease of use to the end user. So in the case of security also, we see user friendly tools, and but because the ecosystem is quite big and therefore there are so many players which are contributing to the Windows ecosystem or Microsoft ecosystem in terms of application development, in terms of hardware devices development which are compatible with Windows or Microsoft products, in this case Windows Server operating system. So therefore, it also becomes a frequent target for malware, because there are more chances that the machine is likely to run a Windows operating system or Windows Server, and therefore the attackers, if they develop a malware, they will find more places to attack, more computer devices, more computers to attack with what they have come up with using their malware, right. So therefore, because of that same large ecosystem that is supporting Microsoft and Windows Server in this particular case, same becomes for the same region, it becomes a target for the attackers, right. So this becomes a negative point in that sense. Then if we talk about the Unix, then there are built-in permissions, and this is high isolation. So earlier we talked about Unix cells or the servers, and the Unix both sell are sold mostly to the organizations or the industry which are into mission critical or that kind of space, security or mission critical, life critical, those kind of industries we are talking about, those kind of organizations we are talking about. So therefore, high isolation is actually desired, so built-in permissions. So therefore, the attack and other chances are also much lower, because the kind of isolation that is achieved by these servers and operating system and other software that are used. If we look at Linux, so then there are granular control, and so there could be issues with the server operating system, and but there is huge open source community that is continuously monitoring these attacks and other loopholes. There are so many eyes that are actually looking at open source codes, and Linux is the flag bearer of open source community. There are so many people looking at Linux source code, so a very rapid community patching happens. So all the developers which are contributing to open source community, if there is anything that goes wrong in terms of security, right, then there would be very rapid patching and testing and all that. So it will be quickly fixed, right. So there is a much more in terms of security, Linux is much better, because in case a security loophole is identified, it is more likely to get quickly fixed in comparison to a Windows, which is a one organization, Microsoft driven or Microsoft supported product, and Unix, which is isolated, and here in this case Linux is much better positioned. Next parameter that we can talk about is efficiency. So how these operating systems compare with respect to efficiency. So if we look at the Windows Server, higher resource overhead due to the GUI that is there. So GUI itself will take, because there is so much of image processing that will also happen to manage those windows and the graphics that are displayed. So therefore high resource overhead that is there in case of GUI. So efficiency will go down, because a big chunk of computing resources, hardware and software, they would actually be engaged in the GUI component of it. But in Unix there is no such overhead, so therefore exceptional stability for mission critical tasks, and that is their primary market segment and which they are catering to, and the stability is desired in those mission critical life critical situations or tasks. So Unix does well in that case. If we look at Linux, it is a lightweight. You can go for lightweight versions of Linux, and high performance on low spec hardware is also observed. So in terms of performance efficiency, Linux is much better because you can achieve the stability like Unix, and you can also you bring in some of the user friendly tools like Windows Server. But if you are looking for pure efficiency point of view, it can be you go for lightweight Linux versions, and high performance you can get, right. Unix will be slightly better, but Linux would also be quite good in terms of performance. At the same time, it can also work well in low spec hardware, which is not the case with the Unix or Windows. Moving on, so if we look at the customization, what are the differentiators for customization for these three operating system. So we look at Windows Server. So it is pretty much standardized. So whatever they offer, it's like you get that. Some configuration you can do, right. So customization chances are much lower. So limited code modification, right, not much you can do here. If you look at the Unix, is stable but rigid. So whatever customization is, that is vendor specific. So that is also customization option here is also lower. But if we come to the Linux, this is highly modular. So customization is very high. That is why from low spec hardware to high end servers, Linux fits in everywhere, right. It's very high modular, can swap components and all that. So in terms of customization, Linux, if some organization has in hardware or some requirement software, some requirement where they also need to customize the operating system, then maybe Linux is something that they can go for, because it is a highly modular in that case, right. So that was about customization and the differences. So Windows Server, Unix being more pretty much lacking option in terms of customization, and Linux giving the option. Moving on, so we look at where we can use these operating systems. We look at the ideal use case. So whatever key parameters that we have discussed for these three server operating system. So we can look at, if we look at Windows Server, what is the best thing, then we can look at ecosystem integration. So if you are already into Microsoft products, then it will make sense for you to go for Windows Server, right. So optimized, because you will get the optimization benefit. So optimized specifically for Microsoft workloads such as .NET frameworks, SQL Server, Exchange, SharePoint. So if you are into these kind of enterprise products from Microsoft's, then it Windows Server will make sense, because these products will work well with Windows Server, because they are coming from the same ecosystem, that is Microsoft ecosystem. So you'll achieve good ecosystem integration, right. So in contrast, if you are going for Unix, then essentially if you are a mission critical, life critical enterprise and you are running a business, you are into defense, space, or maybe health, medical, then you can go for mission critical. You can go for Unix, which is provides supports on mission critical scenarios. You can see the industry that we have mentioned, banking, because the money transactions, and that is very important that we are able to keep track of the transactions and what is happening there. Defense is there. You don't want your defense equipments to fail. Same is for space industry, or then aerospace, the aircrafts and all, right. So these are some of the industries where Unix typically goes. Organizations typically go for Unix. And Linux, if you are into more commercial, like cloud space or web, containers, Docker, you are running cloud apps, hosting, you are a cloud service provider, then Linux is way to go, right. These different use cases, the Linux is going more for if you are providing services to a large segment in terms of enterprises or users, then you would like to go for the cloud, web and containers, Docker, that kind of environment. So Linux would be more suitable. Unix mission critical, and Windows Server when you are using Microsoft products for that ecosystem integration. So that was about that we wanted to discuss in terms of server operating system. So then we'll continue our discussion in the next session. Thank you.